bookshop. It's the bookshop. It's the bookshop of Beverly Farms.
Howdy, everybody. It is Sam Feifel, your host of John Updike's Ghost, your favorite little podcast about reading, writing, bookstores, literature, awesome things. And today, banned books. And we will tell you more about that shortly. I'm joined, as always, by my sister, the co-owner of the bookshop of Beverly Farms, and all-around banned book reader, Hannah Harlow. How are you doing today, Hannah?
I'm doing great. I am live from the bookshop today. We are making sales as we speak, so it's good times.
Good.
Here
Hopefully we're
in the bookshop.
selling some banned books.
We have been selling banned books lately. I know. A bunch of people have been walking in the past few weeks and saying, I want to read some banned books. So I feel like it's a very timely subject.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
And it is a very special day here on John Updike's Ghost because we are joined by Sabrina Baeta. She is with PEN America. She's on their Freedom to Read team. I don't even really know what that is, but it sounds awesome. Sabrina, thank you for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do for PEN America, and then we'll just take it from there and we'll talk about books like we usually do.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. Thank you. Do I even know what I do most days on the Freedom to Read team? That's a great question because there's so much going on right now. So, like you said, I'm a senior program manager on the newly minted Freedom to Read team that's really only been around for about 3 years for PEN, which PEN itself is an organization that is now 100 plus years old. So we've been around the block. We like to say we stand at the intersection of human rights and literature. So that we were started by authors that came together and said, we want to protect the word, we want to protect free expression and the freedom to be able to express ourselves in many different art forms. And from that came 100 years of wonderful work, both with literature awards, which for a while was, what we were most famous for and we're still well known for, but advocacy now. A lot of advocacy around both international and domestic work with free expression. And for me, I am lucky to be able to do the domestic work specifically in education. So you're saying, what is the Freedom to Read team? Well, we look at censorship in K through 12 public education, as well as doing some work with public institutions as well. But colloquially, I have called us the book ban team because that is what we've been looking at. And that's really how we grew as a team. Was I was hired for a 3-month contract to track book bans back in February 3 years ago. So that was 2022. And now I'm still here with a whole fully developed team. So that tells you what direction we're going in there. So when I'm out of a job, I'll be really happy.
For sure.
Totally.
It is unfortunate that there's so much work for you.
And for the past few years, sadly, book banning has been on the rise, correct?
Yeah, hugely on the rise. So from our first year that we were tracking this, we tracked by school year, 2021 to 2022, we had around, I want to say 2,500 bans. It grew to 3,600. And last year we reported in that year alone over 10,000 bans.
Yikes.
That's so nuts. Yikes. But that is due to a couple states in particular.
Yes. So last year in particular was Iowa and Florida. And I'll say I head up the research with my wonderful research team and my research partner, Dr. Tassin Magnuson, shout out. And we really, it looked like Iowa and Florida had many more bans, but there's a whole host of reasons for that, but largely due to legislation in those states that caused book bans, as well as tracking. We always say we are only tracking what's publicly available. It has to be reported in some way. So we were able to get a lot more information on bans in those states. So what we put out is a severe undercount to what's actually going on in the rest of the country if it's not reported.
Sure. And, you're probably not even counting all of the attempted bans that don't happen. So, I know exactly. I'm on the school board, as many of our listeners know. We had one of our own school board members try to ban Kafka on the Shore. But we buried her in process and it did not work. Our neighboring towns had, some chats about Genderqueer, which I know is a book you're going to talk about. today, but luckily those forces were batted back at the gates. So, I can only imagine how much work you've got to do. We have banned books to talk about, though. We always like to talk about our agenda and what we're going to talk about. And so I went and Hannah went and looked at the list of the top 10 banned books in schools that you guys kept track of for last year. I know that also you have some, books that get banned more in the elementary set. I think one of the things I wanted to start with in terms of our agenda is I've got The Kite Runner, which you told me that you read, Sabrina, in high school. I had never read before. It was sitting on my shelf. My whole family had read it. I also have James, which is probably new enough that hasn't really been banned much yet, but I would bet that there are people who are working on it. Hannah, what books have you read this week?
I have The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and I have A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. This is the second book in her Court of Thorns and Roses series. I think the whole series has been extremely banned in many places. I think it's not on the top 10 list this year, but last year a lot of them were on the list, I believe.
Yeah, and Sarah J. Maas is a top banned author.
Oh, for sure. And Sabrina, why don't you tell us the books that you have on your agenda, and then why don't you get us started? Because I know, one of the reasons you guys reached out to us is you've seen an increase in children's books, board books, picture books being banned, which blows my mind. So tell us what you're reading, and then why don't you just jump into the youngest book that you've got for you?
Yeah, so I cheated, and it's not just this week, but I brought a few of my favorites, specifically to do with queer lit. One of them is And Tango Makes Three by Justin Richardson and Peter Parnell, which I'll go into in a second. Another one is Queer Ducks and Other Animals by Eliot, Schrefer, as well as Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. And I think I even had like two more on the list. Genderqueer by Mayako Babe. Really image-heavy books, which images have been really heavily scrutinized lately in books. Not so much the Casey McQuiston book, but those other books.
Tell us about And Tango Makes Three. What, isn't it about like llamas or something? How is it possible that a book like this is banned? What is in this book?
Penguins, maybe?
I was going to say, it is penguins.
Oh, it's penguins. Okay.
Yeah, no, two adorable penguins. And it is literally a picture book. Like, it is meant for children. It's not just a book with pictures. And it's about two penguins in a zoo that fall in love and want to end up having the chance to raise this baby penguin. I don't even know what you would call it, a chick. A little baby penguin called Tango, and Tango makes three. And the thing about these two penguins who fall in love is they're two male penguins. Now, I use it as an example, and one of the reasons this is one of my favorite banned books is, one, it's just adorable. The illustrations are so cute to look at. But two, one of the complaints I get, because part of my research is looking at the book challenge forms, so the reasons why people are trying to ban books. And one of the reasons I saw was that this was not natural, that this was against biology and nature. And the really fun thing about that story is it's a true story. Like, this was actually not a fictionalized account of two penguins. It's a true story that this happened in a zoo in New York, I believe. And that, that brings about Queer Ducks. The other book that I brought is talking about, this concept of queerness in nature, which is more a concept than reality, because obviously those social constructs don't exist within nature, the way that we have, gender in how we look at humanity and humans. I just think it really brings out the irony of the entire book banning movement, that the entire argument is that this is, biologically incorrect, and it's a true story for these two penguins that fell in love.
Totally. Can I ask a question about where books are getting banned? Because we talked about schools, but like picture books, are those bans coming like from school systems or from libraries, or like where do these all get logged?
Yeah, so all of our research, so when you're looking, when I'm talking about these figures and these different numbers, I'm talking about public schools, K through 12 education. That is what we track. That is what we put out. But that is not to say that we're not seeing bans in other public institutions. Obviously, public libraries are still facing a lot of scrutiny, a lot of bans. They're also facing different trends. So public libraries, the nature that, they are available to the public, are also facing things like display bans. Books are being moved from different sections. So from YA to a full adult section, and the permissions are changing. So that's happening somewhat at the school level, but I think it's probably more at the public library level.
And is that... Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, when we're talking about, I know kind of broadly LGBTQ themes are one of the commonly most banned books. And is that generally the argument you see, is that it's not natural? Like, how are they...
It's a whole host
What's
of
their
things.
argument?
Yeah, great question. But it's a whole host of things. When it's, presented in this, like, we don't want to see two moms or two dads in a picture book, then a lot of times the argument is that it's gender ideology. What does that mean? I always say it's not actually about presenting gender, or else the boys' guide to survival would also be banned, but it's not. It is about, attacking the LGBTQ community, and attacking even the concept that young children can learn about families like their own or families that are not like their own, which they should be able to learn about regardless. And then when it gets into, more YA or adult books, we'll see comments that something is pornographic, something is sexually explicit. And a lot of times those labels are being applied to queer materials in cases where it doesn't apply. Also, no book in a school library is pornographic. I'm just going to put that out there. Complete debunk of that. If it's no legal definition of pornography, if, a book like James Baldwin or, I don't know, Toni Morrison is your type of pornography, that's weird. Like, that's your problem, so don't apply that to the book that you're reading. And I say that because, yes, LGBTQ content is absolutely being targeted, but also the most targeted is actually books that have themes of race and racism, or that feature characters or people of color. And I may be segueing into some different books right now, but that is actually the most. I like to show that, because then the intersectionality of those two is also heavily targeted. LGBTQ books that also feature characters of color are heavily targeted, and the authors that those represent are also heavily targeted.
Yeah, it's the children's books objections on the same-sex parents or whatever is among the most dispiriting for me, because like, you don't have to look very hard to find kids in my kids' classes that have same-sex parents. Like, it's not weird anymore. They're not hiding it. Like, our athletic director was in a, two-woman, family. We had, lots of prominent families at the sidelines of things. And to tell kids that, like, it's wrong or perverse in some way to have a book, a children's book with two same-sex parents is like mind-blowing to me. I can't imagine what you'd think if you're just like a little 6-year-old on the rug and being like, oh no, that's banned. Like, it doesn't even make sense. It seems so behind. And maybe I'm in some progressive enclave, but like, there's cows right over there. I'm in a very rural area of Maine. It's not like, I'm in Brooklyn or something. So I find that, among the most frustrating, or anger inducing or whatever it happens to be. It's just so completely, it just ignores like actual people that they know. It's just crazy to me.
It ignores representation. And you brought up, what is a 6-year-old to think? What is a 10-year-old to think when that's banned? They're told the message that that's wrong somehow. Or there's an age where you need to learn about that, or there's, it does couch all of it. And that's part of the reason, even if the ban isn't successful, if a book doesn't end up banned or goes back, that's what it's teaching. It's teaching that somehow this concept is wrong, or there's some, something taboo around it. And that's what we're really trying to fight here, is this concept that there is an age level where you can learn about queerness, or you can learn about, how race plays a part in somebody's life, there shouldn't be an age limit, because for a lot of people, you're born like that. Like, it has nothing to do with age. And the fact, and this is being promoted by a Christian nationalist movement. And that's the reason, they're getting away with it. But it's the idea that even if there is some discomfort around that, it's from a bygone era, and it should be left there. And there needs to be a little bit more insightful, critical thinking about, why am I even thinking about, why that challenge should just be dismissed if there's a challenge to and Tango makes 3, because that's a ridiculous challenge to a book.
Exactly. Why don't we? So I think one of the objections, and I wanted to get into this a little bit with you, is, Sarah J. Maas book. Let's move into that, because, people say, oh, there's explicit sex in the book. And also, it's kind of a trashy book. It's a TikToker book. Like, why do we even care if that's banned? It's not even like it's an educational text. Who cares? If you want to buy it, go buy it at the bookstore. We don't need it in our schools. We don't need it in our public libraries. So, Hannah, like, you're reading this book. Why does this book have to be in my high school library?
It's a fun read, first of all. So, I think it's great to have fun reads around for our kids and
teens. Reading's always supposed to be educational and boring. It's not allowed to be fun.
Yeah. It's sex positive, which, it has a female protagonist. She's super strong. And in this book, she actually has acquired the powers of the high fae. So she's and she's acquired powers from all these different high faes. So she's actually the strongest now of anybody. And she likes having sex, God forbid. So I can see, I guess, why some people would have some issues with it, but I, don't think we should be monitoring when kids are interested in reading about sex, and they're going to come to it at different times. And I personally would love for my kids to pick up a sex positive book that has a strong female protagonist, but obviously not everyone feels that way.
Not everyone feels that way. But when you hear that objection, they can get it at the bookstore. It doesn't need to be in our public school. Sabrina, what do you say in return to that?
Well, it's a really privileged viewpoint to say that a kid, a student, really, because we're talking about high schoolers, not even necessarily kids anymore going into teenagehood, into adulthood. Likely they're not going to have the resources to just on their own go to a bookstore and buy a book. They're going to be reliant on resources maybe from their family or their parents. And for a book like this, because this is probably the biggest hiccup that even some really pro book people will have, is well, that book has sex, so I don't know if that should be in schools. Thank you for saying a high school library. Yes, these books are in high school libraries. People who are in high school are being exposed to sexual experiences. They're being exposed to it through their peers and through their experiences around them. And to me, the softest introduction is through a book. I always say we don't, for any of these, quote unquote, difficult topics, violence is one of them, death and grief is a hugely banned topic, abuse, sexual assault. I think the best introduction is a book. There's
totally.
Turn 18 and suddenly you're exposed to all of those topics at once. Who's planning? You don't know who's really planning to be able to go through puberty like that. So being able to read about it through a book, through a female character who is very empowered, a story about positive sexual experiences, not just negative sexual experiences, because you need both. People need to be able to identify what kind of experience they may, appear in their lives later on, but a story about what consent looks like, a story about how to deal with that, and what it looks like. There's also this idea that, this is, again, students need to understand what sex even is or what it looks like in their own situations, whether it's positive or whether it's a case of rape or sexual assault. A lot of times these books the ones that do deal with sexual assault. It's how young people can realize what happened to them, put language to it, and then help them move on and help them feel less alone in the experience. And then for stories about consent, it gives them the tools and the language to be able to speak about those experiences with partners, with different people, or with trusted adults about this and say, hey, I just read this, what is this? What can we talk about it? And it helps open that door to that further discussion. But it's just a reality that that's what students at that age are going to face. And for me, it's not about having it available because it's rampant within high schools. It's having it available because it's going to be a part of their experiences. And if we're preparing them to enter the world after high school, then of course it's going to have to be a part of their life within high school. Something else I'd like to say, though, is that not every book on a library shelf is for everyone either. Like Sarah J. Maas, to my knowledge, has never been part of curriculum and probably likely won't be part of curriculum anytime soon, which means the student went and chose that book for themselves and can be guided. And what better place to do that than your school library when you have a school librarian, when, parents can be engaged with what their students are reading. So to me, I'm like, okay, yes, those books should be available to the students who want to read about it. And also, maybe they just wanted to read about an empowered female character. Like, don't underestimate students or think they're just grabbing those bits from the stories. That was included. It's within the fabric of the story, but it's not just an out of context scene.
It's so well said. And, I wish more boys would read this book too. Yeah. And books like this, honestly, they have a lot to learn. Yeah. But yep, I lost my train of thought. But
I was going to
want to comment.
Yeah. Well, so your point about, it just being available on the library shelves is a huge one for me. We had this big kerfluffle about genderqueer at more than one school district. Luckily, it didn't come to my school district, but my neighboring district had this kerfluffle about it. And, they looked it up. The book had been taken out from the library like 2 times. So we're talking about 2 kids who were looking for something. They found it in genderqueer. I don't know what their experience was, but it wasn't like this was being forced down anyone's throat, right? And, what was so objectionable to me is this idea that it could not even be available to those few kids who were looking for it, I just kind of try to imagine that kid who's like trying to figure their action out. They don't know what's going on. They're looking for resources, and the librarian says, hey, here's a book for people who have questions like you, very similar, give it a read. The idea that, no, that is just not allowable, it's just so objectionable to me. And what was so funny about it, too, is they're so caught up on, there's this one image of, one of the characters has, a penis in their mouth or something. And it's literally, 4 lines, is the whole, it's like a semicircle and then 2 straight lines, and you get the general idea. And I was like, I'm not even allowed to show this kid a semicircle and 2 straight lines and a couple of colors. It's insane. And, when someone said, do you think that's a legitimate argument to say, hey, look, only 2 people checked it out? Or do you think that kind of undercuts our argument that hey, nobody actually wants this book, so why bother having it? How do you kind of talk about that sort of availability versus everybody? I feel like sometimes the counter objection is, well, if only 2 people want it, why are we spending the $20 of our taxpayer dollars on this anyway, or whatever stupid rejoinder there is. Talk a little bit about your experience with genderqueer, why it's important, and that how you've seen that conversation play out.
So Genderqueer is a graphic memoir by Maya Kobabe, which means as a memoir, it's nonfiction. This is the actual experiences that Maya went through, and it's about non-binary and asexual identity. How many books out there do you think are about non-binary and asexual identity that students may even be interested in reading? Not a ton. So the fact, it's also a relatively new book, relatively new to even being published, right? Concepts like that were not widely circulated before recent times. So to me, 2 people, I'm like, great. Yeah. 2 students who never had a material that represented them. That's a great way to spend my tax dollars. And if you're somebody who's like, well, sexy pornography is not my, idea of spending my tax dollars, which I hear a lot of terms being tossed at that book. That scene that you're describing, which you're also, it's a cartoon-esque scene, sexual scene. So again, weird porn if that's your porn. But I'm not shaming, but okay, weird. If you flip the page, the entire scene is about consent, and it's about saying no. So if you're actually somebody on that side, I'm like, you should be handing that book to your child, because it's all about saying no and how to have that conversation, and about sometimes pleasurable and sometimes being able to have the ability to say, okay, this is no longer pleasurable and for me, and now I'm going to ask, and a supportive partner is going to listen to me when I ask for something to stop. And that's what that book is about. It's a concept that's in almost, I don't know, pretty much every book ever written, which is about figuring yourself out. But because it's told through this lens of asexual and non-binary identity, that's why it's getting banned. It is not the sex scene in that book that is getting banned. It's created a big hoopla because they put it on posters and show up to school board meetings, and all you see is this one out of context panel that, again, I have to insist is a freaking cartoon. It's within the context of a way bigger graphic memoir that is more than just about asexuality or sexual experiences, if you actually, go to the effort of reading it. Not that book banners really ever read the books they're trying to ban. So not that I found, at least. So no, like, to me, it's just another clear example of a book needing to be available and being available for the first time ever for students who, for generations, didn't even have a book that necessarily represented them or gave them the language to understand themselves.
Exactly. My favorite is like when they print out that poster and they bring it and they stand at the podium and they're like, look at this scene. Does this, should this be in our schools? And I'm like, does that really make you uncomfortable? It's like a cartoon. It's so ridiculous. Like, if that makes you uncomfortable, like, you need therapy. Come on. Like, what is the problem here?
And like, this book is also available. Again, it's like, it's in high school. Like, get over yourself if you haven't figured out that concept yet. And you're right, it's a cartoon in a book, and it's weird being blown up and presented in a school board meeting because it was never meant to be blown up and being a lot of things would look real weird if you were to just pause them, take a picture, blow it up, and show up to a school board meeting with them. Like, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of things could be taken out of context if you do that. So
strange. It's so strange. I actually had a question for you because we were talking about The Kite Runner. I had never read it. And I just crushed it over the weekend. Like, I read it so fast. This book is amazing. I kind of knew who Coletta Saney was. It wasn't like, oh, surprise or whatever, but just an incredible voice. I really enjoyed it. I'm super into kind of, books about cultures that I don't have a lot of knowledge about. You get all kinds of great, like, really grainy cultural details about what it was like to be in Afghanistan, before the Taliban came in, and then after the Taliban came in. You get this, like, just amazing story about cultural loss and heartache, and it's a family story. It's a father and son story. It's just, it's a friendship story. There's just so much to dive into. It is like the perfect high school book, if you ask me. I would love to teach this in any of the English classes I used to teach. I actually don't know why people object to it. Is it the, like, rape scene they object to? I mean, it's not even very graphic. It's kind of alluded to. So that's what it is. It's just like a boy raping another boy. It's just, we can't have that, or what's going on?
Yeah. So for me, I was first introduced to this book by reading it in high school, the exact age level that it's being banned in. And to my knowledge at the time, we had no issues. Like, nobody objected. Some people, obviously it's deep content, so we had to have discussions about it. But I even remember reading that scene and not understanding what happened, because I'd never read any kind of depiction of sexual assault before in my life. And having to go and almost reread it, and then starting to realize what this was. And it was the first time I realized that a sexual experience could be negative. Which I was lucky that I was probably 15 or 16 before that happened. I was also vulnerable because I was 15 or 16 before that happened. Like, it never occurred to me that something like that could have a negative connotation to it because of my background. So it was a really important book to me. It was really difficult for me to read because of the content.
It's a difficult book in general. I was like,
which
teared up 5 or 6 times in this book. It's incredibly powerful.
Which to me, that is a natural response. If you read it and you think, "What a great beach read," like I'm like, "What has your life been?" But like, no, like it's important, like it's this idea that some books should make us uncomfortable. Like that was the point of that scene, was to make you uncomfortable. Like if you read it and didn't even bat an eye at it, then again, I'm like, okay, let's sit down and maybe have a conversation about that. But I think that the reason is because of that rape scene, yes, which, by the way, brings up a whole other issue of them calling that, rape and sexual assault sexually explicit or sexual content or pornography, which it's not. It's violence. Rape and sexual assault are violence. It's not like, sexual experiences or sexy things in books. So that's a whole other language thing, rhetoric that they use to try to justify banning these books. But nobody else can see here, but my kitty is joining in. And
we love kitties.
Yes.
You may hear some meows in the back. This is very bookshop, actually. It's giving bookshop. But for me, it was really vital to have this book at that age in my life. And also, I moved on from my life from it. It did not scar me for life. It did not, you know what I mean? Like, it did not change my trajectory within life, other than maybe informing me of something I needed to be informed about. And also depicting an experience, like you said, Sam, like that I'd not been exposed to before. I am an immigrant, but my experience as an immigrant obviously was very different than I'm Brazilian. Like I didn't face what the characters in the book face. And I think it is, all of those things that are tied in, all the different identities that are tied in, are the reason why it's banned, not really that one rape scene.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of, just not, it's part of it's like the celebration of Muslim culture, I'm sure, makes a lot of these Christian folks uncomfortable. But I think the most powerful thing about it is, it's ultimately a story about redemption. And, you're a 15-year-old kid, you've done something, you feel shame, it's about the deepness of his shame. And then, the fact that you can still come back from that, like we can still do good. It's such a powerful message. And so many kids, I work with them all the time on sports teams or whatever. They make a mistake. They are devastated by that mistake, and to see someone make a mistake so heinous and still find a way back, it just seems, just hugely powerful. It's incredibly disappointing to me that this is a subject of bans. Hannah, you were going to say something.
I was going to say something. Oh, I was going to say that, Sabrina, you just touched on a theme that Sam and I often discuss, of that there's just this movement towards people not really wanting to read difficult things. Like they just want easy, they want light, they want, they don't want anything bad to happen in their books. And I'm not saying that's exclusively what they're reading. I'm just saying, people come into the store and that's what they're asking for. And sometimes it's hard to know, I'm like, I can't put warnings on all these books. Like there are some hard things in these books, but ultimately it's really funny and ultimately it's really powerful and moving and I think worth reading. So it's difficult to kind of figure out where that line is sometimes of like, we need to read these books and we need to read hard books. And yeah. Every once in a while you need a light book, but hopefully you're reading a mix.
Yeah. And it's a question too, not to taking a little bit of an artist angle. I would also write and musician in a previous life. But does art have the right to be about the real human experience? And for me, yeah.
I would hope so.
I don't think we have, I hope so. So why are we censoring the human experience within art? Because it's too hard. And that's, yes, it's in schools, but we've seen this censored across the board as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Baldwin, Hannah, because I think that's one of the scariest things is, you see these schools in the South particularly banning references to slavery, kind of glossing over this, history that the U.S. has of race relations, this idea that we're in some sort of post-racial America, which is insane. tell us about this Baldwin. I haven't read Baldwin probably since college. What was the experience like? Why is anybody banning that?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I actually feel like I don't think I've ever read James Baldwin, and I, felt like it was high time. He's become sort of pervasive in our pop culture. There in movies. He's, there's quotes from him all over Instagram, whatever. So I felt like I knew what he was about, but I hadn't actually read him before. The Fire Next Time is sort of 2 essays. The first is a letter to his nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation. And then the second piece is a much longer piece. That first one's pretty short. And the second one's a much longer piece that kind of begins as like his breakup letter to the church. Like he was kind of a youth preacher, starting from like 14 to 17. He felt like the church was kind of the only place he could go. Like the other option was the street and like drugs and like, those were the 2 options. And so he went to the church and eventually just felt like the church was like a morally bankrupt place that
you don't say.
What I loved was his generosity of spirit. Like he was like, I wanted to love everybody. Like I didn't want to hate white people. And the church was saying I had to. Like this was like the Black Christian church. And he was like we can't be free until white people sort of let us be free, like until they think of us as equal too. And yeah, we could hate them for just taking forever to get there, but I'd rather like have compassion and like, show them love and like, yeah, I pity them for, not being able to see us the way we should be seen. But I found that really moving. And I mean, this was written in 1963. I think it's really disappointing to see how we really haven't come very far since he wrote this. Almost everything he's written in here is still really relevant. And then he goes into talking about, a bunch of other things, which I'm not going to get into. But I think if we're thinking about kind of the Christian nationalist movement, I could see how they wouldn't really like how he's talking about religion. There is a point at the end where he's saying, like, there are a lot of people who really don't know the African Americans' history. Like, they haven't actually engaged with what slavery was. Mm-hmm. And, they're whitewashing it. They're not learning the real history. And I think in like my like liberal bubble, I find that really hard to comprehend. But but then you see that like now they're not allowed to teach that history in school.
Yeah, it's baffling. I mean, I think, I read James again, like in 24 hours or something crazy.
I love James.
And for
Everyone
people
who listens to the podcast knows that already.
I know. We've talked about James on the pod a bunch of times. I saved it for myself because I knew I was going to love it, and I wanted to read it like after kind of all the hubbub had kind of gone. He'd already won the awards. I wanted to like save it a little bit. And it's actually better than I thought it was going to be. I think it's, it's just a revelatory book. The voice is incredible. The commentary on code switching and the commentary on, we are the person that we have to be in the moment. And, the way that it made me think about how so many people are different people than they probably are in real life when they encounter me. If I'm a person of authority, if I'm on the school board, I know that, teachers are different around me, even though they're the parents of my kids' friends or whatever, because I'm on the school board, they speak a different way. They are a different way. To think about, just the depravity of slavery. Like I actually don't think our brains can really comprehend it. But what James does is distills it into the starkest examples you can imagine, and to see it play out and to know that's definitely how it went down. And it was actually maybe even probably worse because you have to be a certain level of creative to think up this kind of human depravity. And like, I agree with that. I don't think people really understand what it was like to buy and sell humans and to treat them like disposable objects. And, it is so horrifying that I think your brain on some level just sort of shuts down and is like, oh, that can't possibly happen, And it's actually in the Kite Runner too. I mean, one of the, the books complement each other amazingly, with the Hazara in Afghanistan, we're a slave class, and this Khaled Hosseini, they had slaves by any, maybe they're servants instead of slaves, but it's really, it's a distinction without a difference. And I think you have to understand how bad things can get to understand how bad things can get, it was such a stark example. And I think you shouldn't be allowed to graduate high school without reading this. And the idea that some people would think we should keep it from others is just insane to me. Sabrina, you see these objections. I'm assuming people are saying, about Baldwin, about, other books about slavery, like these images are too horrible for kids to encounter. What are you seeing?
I mean, in a way, I almost wish that's what I was saying, because it would mean that our history books had caught up and we're starting to tell the truth about racism in this country. And they're not. Like slavery in history books is still talked about very generally as a past period. But something that all of these books and still history books usually do bring up is how institutionalized it is. And that's something, credit also to James Baldwin, spent a career talking about this, that the institutions that carry this forward are still present today. So yes, it's important to know what happened in our past and make sure that we don't, revert back to something like that. But it's also important to realize that you didn't have to have a personal, stake. I wasn't born during this time period of, established slavery, but I am born during a time when there's a lot of institutionalized racism within the structures that I'm working in. And a lot of the complaints we get with these books is that they're quote unquote woke, that they're CRT, that they're CRT. What does CRT even mean at this point outside of the legal context? Because it's been so blown up. And it's really all words for saying, I don't want to feel uncomfortable about what my ancestors or what somebody who looks like me necessarily did. Again, I think you should be uncomfortable. I don't know how you could read this history and not be uncomfortable with it and not ask yourself, like, what can I do? How is this still present? And what can I do going forward to be able to eradicate or at least be able to diminish the effects of this on the people around me? And I think those, what I would call basic skills of empathy, should be required reading. And it is uncomfortable and it is difficult to discuss. But it's, this idea that we are past, seeing race in our society, or that somehow ending DEI initiatives is going to create a perfectly equal society, is ridiculous to anybody who doesn't have just an ounce of privilege. I'm Brazilian and I'm queer, but I am white and I look white and I don't have an accent on my English, purely because my mom is American and taught me from a young age. I lucked out in a lot of departments. I'm not so, as privileged in other departments, but it doesn't take a lot for me to be like, oh, okay, I can see how this still affects some people today. I can see how this affects communities of color. And yes, it is my responsibility to shed some of my privilege and just act like a decent human being towards the situation and be able to understand a little bit more about it. And it's not about having to be so steeped in it that you become a scholar. But I would say that the bare minimum is making sure you're not banning material about it for other people to read.
Right. I think, I guess I feel like some of the white people denying this history and wanting to know anything about it is that they feel this shame, right? They feel like,
Exactly.
These books are shaming them and that they somehow did something wrong. But, what was so beautiful about the James Baldwin was he was not, I'm a white reader and I felt no shame from him. I just felt like he was so generous to say, I don't hate you and I don't blame you. And I just want to work with you. Right. It just wasn't there, that shaming. And
yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the
I wish
most
people would just like give it a try.
yeah. Well, I think that's one of the
Read
most
it.
persuasive arguments for, you know, DEI efforts or whatever it happens to be in curriculum is, you know, we are depriving our kids of like the wonder of diverse voices, right? Like, you know, think about how cruel it is to our kids if we would only show them books that look like them or act like them or sound like them. What a boring ass world that is, you know? Like the wonder of life is coming across something and being like, holy shit, never seen that before. That's amazing. And we're keeping that from kids by, you know, cloistering them and making it so, oh, you know, we'll just tell little stories that, you know, make us all feel good about ourselves. It's just horrible to think that we're depriving these kids of this experience that they can't otherwise get. If you grow up in Gray, New Gloucester, Maine, I think we have like 5 people of color in our entire school system, you know, and people grow up thinking that's the way the world is. If they don't go anywhere else, we have kids that have never been the 30 minutes south to Portland. If they're not reading books, if they're not watching movies, if they're not exploring things in art, they're going to think the whole world looks like this. And that's incredible. That's like, imagine when they go to school or imagine when they leave the state of Maine and encounter places that are not like this. They're so ill prepared. We're screwing them by not having them read books like this. And I find that incredibly frustrating. I don't know.
And
It's
also,
just
I mean,
mean.
I benefited from reading books about, you know, men protagonists. I benefited from can't tell you how many straight romances I read that never made me straight. So like, you know, like it's okay to also read books that are different, different in some way than you are, and you still glean huge things. Most of us will never own dragons, but we read a lot of fantasy books with dragons. You know what I mean? We can understand how we still relate to the material. And our place in it. And I for also there's all these statistics out about how like over 50% of school children come from communities of color, families of color at this point. So it's like that is the world
That is the
we're
world.
entering. And it again, even if it was only 5 students, it's still worthy. If there's only 2 students checking out genderqueer, it is still worth it that material is available to them, and that and also history should just be accurately reflected. Like that's
Yes.
I'm like, regardless of the representation, you can make all these arguments, but there's also just the truth, and that's what should be present for students to learn.
Sabrina, you should
100%.
see me in our children's room when people come in and they're like, I have to buy a book for a boy, so it has to be a male protagonist. And I'm like, hell no, it does not.
Drives me
No,
crazy.
it doesn't.
Drives me
By the
nuts.
way, they've got that covered. Don't worry.
they're all
Like,
set.
please go find something else. Like, what if they're not a boy too? We didn't even talk about the attack on trans kids, but
oh god.
Yeah. Well, let's finish up though I think the only book we haven't really talked about is the Red, White, and Royal Blue, and I think this is an interesting to talk about because we've seen this kind of. Yeah, I think it's a good thing. There's like an explosion of gay romance, you know, even in the last like 3 years, I would say, you know. And what I like about them the most is they look just like the other romances. They have the same terrible cartoon covers that make me want to, you know, strangle their designer. They, you know, have the same ridiculous, like, oh, you know,
taglines.
No, well, like the tropes, you know, I hate like this whole trope discourse, like, oh, it's the, you know, grumpy, happy trope or whatever, you know, like it's just like, I hate it when they distill plots to like one sentence. But like, I think, you know, Hannah and I talk about this all the time. Like the big advance that we've seen in queer literature is that books used to, if there was a queer character, it was always about the plot line was about their queerness. Now we just see queer characters just doing normal shit because they're just normal people. And I think this like whole queer romance thing is like the height of that where, yeah, it's just a romance, but instead of a guy and a girl, it's 2 guys or it's 2 girls or it's 2 non-binaries or whatever the hell it is. And it's just like a normal romance. So tell us about, I have not read Red, White, and Royal Blue. We actually went through a spate where we read like a bunch of gay romances last year. And we were like, is every romance gay now?
Well, I feel like this one was one of the kind of early, like what it was incredibly popular when it came out a few years ago now.
Yeah,
but,
it became
so tell us.
TikTok. Like it really, I think,
right.
took off because of TikTok and the viral element of that. And for me, I've got a bookshelf, 2 bookshelves behind me, and they're full of queer romance. It is my favorite genre. I love like a happy little story where my 2 queers are going to end up together and in love. And one of the reasons is anybody who's done, light queer studies knows the trope of them dying at the end. So to me, I'm like, this is a great counter movement of queer joy that they're going to have a happy story, and it's either going to acknowledge homophobia or it's not going to acknowledge homophobia, or it's going to play with the idea of it. But it is just presenting it as normal because, newsflash, if you're somebody who's uncomfortable, listening, maybe who's uncomfortable with this topic and is trying to get more comfortable with it, go read a little gay romance. Can be YA if you wanted to avoid some of the sexy bits or something. Like start the same way that, young readers start, and go up in the different levels if you need to. But it shows that it is no different than any straight romance, except it just happens to be 2 genders that normally don't get put together in a heteronormative society. So for me, I love Casey McQuiston's book because the characters are just really enticing, I think, to read and to follow. I have the newest Casey McQuiston novel on my desk right now, The Pairing. And to me, it's always these like really interesting hooks at the beginning in setups. Red Wine and Royal Blue, it's about the president's son and a prince of England kind of hitting it off. I won't give away too much for anybody who wants to go read it, but it's just fun to read, and it's a romance like any other, and they have cute banter, and it just seems very natural. And that's what I love that it's done for people, is it's been able to present that. And it is 2 men in that story, but it's funny because most of my friends who love that book are women. Like because they just appreciate a romance. They see themselves in the characters regardless. And yes, it has sexy bits, and I already discussed why that's important, that it could be there. Like I said with some of the other, Sarah J. Maas books, it's not going to appear in curriculum, I think, anytime soon. But that's okay. But it is really important for representation. For me, I know when I came out, I had never, it took 1 book, by the way, reading 1 queer book for me to be like, oh, and it wasn't even something with like sexy bits. It was Glennon Doyle's Untamed. Like that was the book. Like it is like a memoir about being a mom and falling in love with Abby Wambach, which the being a mom I didn't want, but the falling in love with Abby Wambach sounded pretty great. So, but that media is what helped normalize it for me. It's what helped me realize because I was like, is this different than, what I've been kind of practicing, and like what hasn't felt true to me? Is this going to feel the same? Do I have to act different? Do I have to look different? Like there's a lot of questions because there's a lot of what society says a queer person is, and media like this, especially by queer people, helps answer those questions and make you realize that no, like queerness in itself can exist even outside of the societal expectations of it, and you can decide to be part of some of them. I have a septum ring that you can't see because I'm not on camera, but I have a septum ring. And I can look queer in other ways, and then I can look really femme and, not queer in other ways, and that's okay. But I feel like it's books like this that really normalize it for queer individuals, especially those starting out on their journeys, that like it's really important rep for them to have available, and even just having it available on a shelf, seeing that it's there with the other books about straight romances, regardless of whether a student ever picks it up, is really important for helping establish that in our community, this is okay. This is equal. You will be valued. You will be accepted.
I love that. Even just even it being on the shelf.
Yeah, no.
It matters.
It matters. Yeah. It matters so much. And again, it matters for whether a student picks it up or not, but it matters to have it available for the 2, for the 20, whether it becomes TikTok viral, whether, it only saves 1 student at one point. It matters too in your public libraries, and it matters in your bookshops too. The first thing I do, like I said, I love my queer romances. So the first thing I do in any bookshop is I go to the romance section and I see, like, how did they set up their bookshelf? Do they have any queer romances? I can't tell you how many times I've gone in there and haven't seen myself represented at all, like any sapphic books in there that can speak to a love story like mine. And that's saddening. And it's also just not accurate. Like, I'm here, I exist. Like, it's not just not having them on the shelf doesn't make it disappear. So We should be able to, even if you can't agree with the content, which I suggest you do some research and try to figure that out, but even if you can't agree with the content, can we at least agree that it should be available?
Yeah, I thought one of the most powerful things I saw, I'm in our schools all the time. I walked into the high school library and they had like a romance display for Valentine's Day because it's February or whatever. And there was, Casey McQuiston's book. And I was like, it wasn't like in the queer section. It wasn't, rainbow, colored. It was just another book in the, romance selection. And I was like, yes, that's how, just put them all in there, let the kid pick up whatever they want. They'll, and I think also it does a lot of these books like a disservice to like throw them in this rainbow section, because then kids, kids or adults or whoever is like, oh, that's not for me, I'm not queer. And so then they go and head to a different section. But then you miss out on reading a book about an experience you don't know about, And I have picked up books. I just pull, books off our ARC shelf. I have no idea what they are. I was just like, who knows what this might be. And I'm always pleasantly surprised. I'm like, oh, hey, it's a queer book, or, like you just don't know what it is. And I find that much more interesting because I don't know what this character is going to do. I don't know who they're going to fall in love with. I don't know what the big reveal is going to be, rather than, oh, here's a guy and a girl. I know they're going to hook up eventually, get to it. Like I just find it much more interesting to not have them, put in these little genres.
Yeah, and you're right. And genres is a whole other discussion. And so is placement of books, because
Yes.
I both love it when it's like all together, but then I'm also like, where like
yeah, you can't find it yourself.
Yeah, I'm like,
Right.
and I have some labels here. I'm like, I just want to read my sapphics. So
we don't even have a romance section. We just throw the romance in the
Everything's
fiction.
all mixed in. People come in, they're like, where's your romance section? Where's your LGBTQ section? And I'm like, all mixed in fiction. So I'm going to come help you. That's, we're a small shop. It's personalized experience. So then it's me like frantically pulling stuff off the shelf.
But yeah, it's all just fiction, I don't know. I hate it when because you never know. Like there's lots of literature that's really just romance, dressed up in long words or whatever. All right, we are getting to the end of our program here. Sabrina, was there anything that you particularly wanted to talk about in terms of PEN America's efforts or anything like that we haven't talked about, or, any reminders you want to give to, we're pretty much preaching to the choir. I doubt there's a lot of hardcore book banners hanging out on the John Updike's Ghost podcast, but, in general, you never know, but anything that you wanted a chance to cover that we didn't get a chance to?
No, honestly, it's been a great discussion. And I would say that if you're somebody who's looking to do something about it, and you're thinking, oh God, like those do look bad. Those book bans are really bad and it's happening on a national scale. Go local. Like you've heard a lot of talk about what is going on in local school boards, local libraries. Go local and figure out if there's a group that you can help, if, what's happening at your local school board, what's happening at your local library, if there have been book bans. And I always say you can take a proactive approach. Go to your bookstores, your libraries, your schools, and say thank you for what they do have available. If they have Casey McQuiston out, that librarian, I guarantee you, still had a little bit, had hesitation and was like, nope, this book is important. I'm going to put it right here, but I may get a complaint about it. So if you see that, it helps a lot if you go to them and you say, and it just takes a second to be like, love that you had that book available. You don't even have to talk about what's in the book or why it's available. They'll understand. But supporting our teachers and librarians during this time, they're really undergoing a lot. And if it's not already at their doorstep, which I would think probably it already is, even if we haven't heard about it necessarily in a district, it may be coming, and they're still scared for themselves and their friends and their colleagues. So be proactive about offering that positive feedback before the negative starts showing up.
I love that. Because, I live in Massachusetts. We think it doesn't happen here, and it totally does.
It does.
Yeah. Coincidentally, I have a shout out to a promo for an upcoming event. Coincidentally, the Leading Ladies is a local organization. They're kind of a civic organization. They stopped in today and asked if we would sell books at a banned book event that they are hosting on March 26th at the Cabot Theater in Beverly. It's a 7 p.m. event. So we will have a table set up there with banned books for sale.
What day was that again?
It's Wednesday, March 26th.
March 26th. All right, make sure we pimp that on the next one too, so I don't forget. All right. Well, Sabrina, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you stopping by the old John Updike's Ghost podcast.
You were great, Sabrina. You made us sound smarter.
That's great.
No, thank you so much for giving me an excuse to talk about the books I love.
All right. And you've heard lots of great things about lots of great books. Go out and read them. And we'll see you next time on John Updike's Ghost.